January 31, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T.M.C. Coy lowered his camera, his hand steady despite what he'd just seen. The tropical sun beat down on the tarmac, where an intact Mitsubishi G4M bomber sat abandoned, its cylindrical fuselage gleaming like polished metal. Tail number 76312. The Japanese crew had fled during the American advance, leaving behind something M.C. Coy's Technical Air Intelligence Unit had been hunting for 3 years: an untouched Betty bomber. M.C. Coy had seen dozens of these aircraft before, twisted wreckage scattered across Pacific islands, burned skeletons on jungle airstrips, broken pieces floating in lagoons. But never like this. Never whole. Never with every system intact, every panel accessible, every secret exposed. He walked slowly around the aircraft, noting details in his field notebook. 20 meters from nose to tail, 25-meter wingspan, twin 14-cylinder radial engines, each producing 1,500 horsepower, tricycle landing gear that gave it that distinctive nose-up attitude on the ground. The airframe showed no battle damage. Not a single bullet hole marred its aluminum skin. This was how the Japanese built them. This was what they considered combat-ready. M.C. Coy climbed onto the wing, his boots finding purchase on the smooth metal surface. He'd been photographing captured enemy aircraft across the Southwest Pacific for 18 months, documenting everything from Zero fighters to reconnaissance planes. He knew what to look for: armor plating thickness, gun positions, engine specifications, defensive systems. The routine details that would fill reports read by intelligence officers and aircraft designers back in the States. But the Betty had a reputation that made it different. American pilots called it the Flying Lighter. Some called it the One-Shot Lighter or the Flying Zippo, always references to fire, to the way these bombers exploded when hit. M.C. Coy had read the combat reports. 2 or 3 machine gun rounds anywhere along the fuselage produced catastrophic results: flames, explosions, aircraft that disintegrated in seconds. Fighter pilots actively hunted them because they were such easy kills. He opened an inspection panel on the wing's upper surface, expecting to find the standard array of protective systems that every modern bomber carried. His flashlight beam played across the interior structure: spars, ribs, fuel cell connections. He moved to another panel, then another, working methodically across the wing's center section where the fuel tanks were located. Then he stopped. He closed the panel, opened it again, checked his position, consulted his technical manual. He moved to the opposite wing and repeated the process. His notebook lay forgotten on the wing surface as he examined panel after panel, his movements becoming faster, more urgent. "This cannot be their standard design," he said aloud to no one. No Air Force would build bombers this way. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings of any kind. Just thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. M.C. Coy had studied aeronautical engineering at MIT before the war. He understood aircraft design, understood the compromises engineers made between performance and protection, understood that every kilogram added to an aircraft reduced either its range or its payload. But this wasn't a compromise. This was something else entirely. American bombers, the B-17, the B-24, even medium bombers like the B-25, all featured self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. British bombers had them. German bombers had them. The technology had been standard for years, implemented despite the substantial weight penalty because it dramatically improved crew survival rates. Yet here sat Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks that offered zero protection. McCoy pulled out his camera and began photographing every detail: the wing structure, the fuel cell mounting points, the complete absence of protective systems. His hands moved automatically while his mind raced through calculations. The weight saved by eliminating protection systems, 500 kilograms, perhaps more. The additional fuel capacity that weight saving permitted. The extended range that additional fuel provided. The price in crew lives. He'd seen enough burning Betty bombers in combat footage to understand what these unprotected tanks meant. Every time a machine gun round punctured that thin aluminum skin, fuel sprayed into the slipstream. Every tracer round that hit those tanks ignited fuel vapor. Every cannon shell that struck anywhere near the wings produced an explosion. The Japanese had built a bomber that was extraordinarily capable and fundamentally doomed. But why? What possible justification could explain this decision? McCoy looked up from his camera at the massive aircraft sitting before him. Its sleek lines spoke of speed. Its large wings suggested long range. Its size indicated serious payload capacity. This wasn't a poorly designed aircraft. Everything about it suggested careful engineering, sophisticated manufacturing, deliberate choices made by skilled designers. They had built exactly what they intended to build. The question was, what had they intended? 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941, McCoy had been a junior engineering officer at Wright Field in Ohio, testing American bomber prototypes. That morning, while smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 82 of these same Betty bombers had lifted off from bases on Formosa, heading south. Their target had been this exact spot, Clark Field, Philippines. The attack had achieved complete surprise. Lieutenant James Harrington watched from the ground as the formation appeared at 12:35 in the afternoon, perfect V-shapes etched against the tropical sky at 20,000 feet, far beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. He'd been eating lunch in the officers' mess when the air raid sirens began wailing, their sound somehow both urgent and already too late. By the time he reached the flight line, the bombs were falling. 636 bombs in the first wave alone, marching across Clark Field's runways and facilities in precise patterns that spoke of careful planning and professional execution. Harrington dove into a bomb shelter as the earth heaved, dust and smoke filling the air, the concussions hammering his chest even through reinforced concrete walls. Then came the fighters, Zeros dropping from altitude like hawks, their machine guns tearing through everything that had survived the bombing. Harrington watched through the shelter's observation slit as his squadron's P-40 Warhawks exploded one after another, beautiful aircraft transformed into burning wreckage in seconds. The Betty bombers themselves never came within range of American guns. They flew their patterns at altitude, released their weapons with precision, and withdrew north in the same perfect formations they'd arrived in. Untouched. Untouchable. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated. What struck me, Harrington later wrote in his combat report, was how they came in. Perfect formation. High altitude. Totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne. But the Betty bombers themselves departed untouched. 2 days later, those same bombers demonstrated their true capability. December 10, 1941, South China Sea. Captain William Tennant stood on the bridge of HMS Prince of Wales, watching his radar operator track the incoming aircraft. 26 bombers, a mixture of Betty and the older Nell types, approaching from the northeast in multiple waves. Prince of Wales was a battleship displacing 43,000 tons, armed with 10 14-inch guns and bristling with anti-aircraft weapons. Beside her sailed HMS Repulse, a battle cruiser modernized in the 1930s specifically to counter air threats. Together they formed Force C, dispatched to demonstrate British naval power in Asian waters and deter Japanese aggression. That deterrence had failed 3 days earlier. Now these ships were the deterrents, capital ships that could destroy any Japanese surface force, floating fortresses that represented generations of naval supremacy. Tennant ordered evasive maneuvers as the first wave began its attack run. The Betty bombers came in low and fast, approaching from multiple angles in coordinated waves. Their torpedo runs were executed with a precision that stunned the British gunners, each aircraft dropping to wave-top height at exactly the calculated distance, releasing its Type 91 torpedo at exactly the right moment, then pulling up sharply to evade anti-aircraft fire. The torpedoes ran true. Prince of Wales took the first hit amidships, the underwater explosion sending a shudder through the massive hull. Then another hit, and another. Tennant felt the deck tilt beneath his feet as flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. The ship's modern compartmentalization, designed to withstand torpedo damage, couldn't cope with the volume of water pouring through multiple breaches. Repulse maneuvered desperately, her captain twisting the battle cruiser through tight turns that a smaller destroyer would have struggled to match. But there were too many torpedoes in the water, too many bombers coordinating their attacks, too many angles of approach. 4 hits, then 5. At 1:20 in the afternoon, Prince of Wales capsized, her massive hull rolling over as the crew abandoned ship. 13 minutes later, repulse followed. 841 British sailors died. The survivors clung to wreckage in the tropical water, watching their ships, symbols of empire, products of the world's greatest naval tradition, disappear beneath the waves. The Betty bombers reformed and departed for their bases, having accomplished in 90 minutes what naval theorists had debated for decades. For the first time in history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power while in the open sea. Across the Pacific through early 1942, the Betty seemed to operate everywhere simultaneously. Darwin, Australia, bombed from bases 1,500 kilometers away. Port Moresby, attacked from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges. Guadalcanal, struck from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 kilometers. The aircraft demonstrated operational reach that Allied commanders couldn't counter and couldn't match. American bombers of the period, B-17s, B-25s, had ranges measured in hundreds of miles. The Betty operated in thousands. It could strike targets that Allied forces assumed were safe, attack from bases that were themselves beyond Allied striking range, project Japanese power across ocean expanses that seemed to defy geographic reality. This advantage defined the first 6 months of the war. But advantages built on assumptions collapse when those assumptions prove false. August 8, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. 23 Betty bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul for what should have been another routine strike against American positions. The crews had made this run before, 600 kilometers each way, bombed the airfield at Henderson Field, returned to base. American fighter strength on Guadalcanal remained limited. The odds favored survival. They were wrong about the odds. American Wildcat fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. What happened next would be repeated with brutal consistency for the next 3 months. Betty bombers burning, exploding, disintegrating under fire that should have been survivable. 18 of the 23 bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died, the single worst G4M loss of the entire war, though the losses on that day would soon blend into a steady stream of casualties that Japanese forces couldn't sustain. Fighter pilots reported the same observation across every engagement. The Betty exploded with minimal hits. 2 rounds in the wing and flames erupted. 3 rounds in the fuselage, and the aircraft disintegrated. 1 burst from a .50 caliber machine gun often proved fatal. First time we caught a Betty formation, "We couldn't believe how easy they went down," Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn later reported. His VF-17 squadron flew F-4U Corsairs out of Guadalcanal. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and they'd explode. "We actively hunted them." By October 1942, more than 100 Betty bombers had been lost over the Guadalcanal campaign. Crew casualties approached 700 men. The exchange rate was catastrophic. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. The Betty's reputation shifted from respect to contempt, from feared adversary to preferred target. But the true story, the engineering decisions that made such losses inevitable, remained hidden in the wreckage scattered across Pacific islands and ocean floors. American intelligence knew the aircraft burned easily. They didn't yet understand why it had been built that way. That understanding would require an intact example. That understanding would require tail number 76312, sitting abandoned on a Philippine airfield, waiting for Major M.C. Coy to climb inside its wings and discover a design philosophy so alien to Western military thinking that it would take months to fully comprehend. September 1937. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Nagoya, Japan. Hiro Honjo spread the Navy's specification documents across his drafting table and confronted an impossible problem. The Imperial Japanese Navy wanted a land-based bomber with a range of 4,722 kilometers, unloaded. With 800 kilograms of bombs, or torpedoes, it still needed to reach 3,700 kilometers. Top speed, 398 kilometers per hour. Cruising altitude, 3,000 meters. No bomber in service anywhere in the world could meet these requirements. Honjo had studied at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European engineering principles before returning to Japan. He understood what the Navy was asking for. He also understood what they weren't saying. These specifications were calculated based on the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict, from Formosa to the Philippines, 460 kilometers. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 kilometers. From Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of kilometers. The Navy didn't want a bomber. They wanted reach, the ability to strike enemy positions far beyond carrier aircraft range, to project power across ocean expanses that geography itself should have made impassable. Honjo assembled his engineering team and began the calculations that would define everything that followed. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity, 4,780 liters minimum. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed 0.8 kilograms. That meant 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight at full load. To achieve the required speed carrying this fuel, the aircraft needed minimal empty weight. Every kilogram mattered. Honjo's team calculated weight budgets for every component. Airframe structure, as light as possible while maintaining integrity. Engines, powerful enough for speed, efficient enough for range. Weapons, adequate for the mission, no excess. Defensive armament, minimal. Then came the question that would haunt the Betty throughout its service life. Crew protection. American bombers incorporated armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot seats, steel plates 8 millimeters thick, weighing approximately 150 kilograms. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage, another 200 kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through rubber compounds and additional structure, approximately 400 kilograms for a bomber of the Betty's size. Fire suppression systems added more weight. Redundant safety measures added more weight still. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would exceed 800 kilograms. That was 800 kilograms that couldn't be fuel. That was range measured in hundreds of kilometers sacrificed for protection. That was the difference between meeting the Navy's requirements and failing them. Honjo made his decision. He didn't make it lightly. His engineering notes, preserved in Mitsubishi's archives, show the calculations. He knew what unprotected fuel tanks meant in combat. He knew that battle damage to the wings would prove catastrophic. He knew the risks. But he also knew that the Navy's requirements couldn't be met any other way with available technology. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be thin aluminum construction, no self-sealing compounds, no armor plating, no fire suppression beyond basic extinguishers. 8 tanks arranged in the wing's center section where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, achieving the range the Navy demanded. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. It met every performance requirement. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. The Navy accepted it immediately. Production began in April 1941. By December, approximately 180 Betty bombers were in service. None of the crews who flew them in those early months understood what Honjo's choices would mean. The aircraft was magnificent, fast, long-ranged, capable of reaching targets that seemed impossibly distant. At Clark Field, against 4C, across the Philippines and Malaya, and the Netherlands East Indies, the Betty dominated. But that dominance rested on assumptions that were already crumbling. The assumption that surprise would protect bombers. The assumption that enemy fighter opposition would remain limited. The assumption that the war would be short and decisive. By Guadalcanal, all 3 assumptions were dead. Former Flight Petty Officer Masayuki Yokota completed 28 combat missions in Betty bombers before being transferred to training duties in October 1942. He was one of the fortunate ones. Most of his squadron died over the Solomon Islands during those terrible months. Years later, he offered the most direct assessment of the aircraft he'd flown. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. There was no middle ground with the Betty. No wounded bombers limping home. No damaged but survivable aircraft. Hid anywhere in the wing area and fuel sprayed into the slipstream. Any tracer round ignited that fuel. The aircraft either returned untouched or exploded. Japanese engineers recognized the problem by mid-1943. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced, they installed 30mm rubber sheets beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These weren't true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection. Crew survival rate showed no significant improvement. The G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944, featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks. Fuel capacity was reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the sealing material. Maximum range dropped to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of over 2,000 kilometers compared to the original. Approximately 60 Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. Too late, too few. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. April 18, 1943. The Betty's vulnerability became the instrument of Admiral Isaraku Yamamoto's death. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville aboard a G4M bomber. 18 P-38 Lightnings were assigned to intercept. The mission required extraordinary precision. Fly over 400 miles at wave-top height, navigate by dead reckoning, arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. At 9:34 in the morning, The P-38 spotted Yamamoto's formation, two Betty bombers at low altitude with 6-0 fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier engaged the lead bomber. His round struck the wing area where unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded and crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. The unprotected fuel tanks had guaranteed that successful interception would be fatal. There was no possibility of survival once the aircraft came under attack. March 21, 1945. 18 Betty bombers departed Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MX-Y-7 Oka rocket bomb, a piloted weapon with a 1,200-kilogram warhead designed for kamikaze attacks. The mission required the bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of American ships before releasing the Oka. American F-6F Hellcat fighters intercepted the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable, proved completely helpless while carrying the external Oka weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The drag reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. Systematically, the American fighters destroyed the entire formation. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets couldn't survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. 4 months later, on August 19, 1945, two white-painted Betty bombers with green crosses departed Otsugi Airfield. They carried Japan's surrender delegation to meet with Allied forces, the final flight of aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. Lieutenant Denzo Sudo piloted one of the surrender aircraft. The crew wore dress uniforms. The bombers carried no weapons, no ammunition, nothing military except what was necessary for flight. American fighters escorted them throughout their journey, ensuring safe passage while preventing any deviation from planned routes. The circle was complete. At Clark Field, in January 1945, Major M.C. Coy had finished his examination of tail number 76312. His report, classified secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, contained detailed specifications and one unavoidable conclusion. The Betty bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply didn't include bringing Japanese crews home alive. American bombers, B-17s, B-24s, B-25s, featured comprehensive protection systems that added over 800 kilograms to empty weight. American doctrine considered this weight penalty essential because trained crews represented assets more valuable than aircraft. American factories could replace bombers more easily than experienced combat veterans. American studies demonstrated the effectiveness with statistical precision. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by 75%. Protected crew positions increased survival rates in damaged aircraft by 3 to 4 times. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. Honjo's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. It assumed achieving surprise would provide protection. It assumed enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed the war would be short. All those assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength made Betty interception routine. By late 1942, pilots had learned to exploit every vulnerability. By 1943, missions became suicide operations. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight. Approximately 2,414 Betty bombers were produced across all variants. Few survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by fires that unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. Thousands of Japanese aircrew died, their deaths made nearly inevitable by choices made in 1937 by an engineer facing impossible requirements. Hiro Hanjo had created exactly what the Navy specifications demanded, an aircraft with extraordinary range, built with minimal weight, optimized for mission requirements. The fuel tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving required performance. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of 1937 technology and 1937 assumptions. But those assumptions collapsed under sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and growing technological advantage. MC Coy stood beside tail number 76312 in the fading tropical light, his documentation complete. The crew who'd abandoned this aircraft had survived by walking away. Most Betty crews weren't so fortunate. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers, crossed vast Pacific distances, and died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires their own aircraft's design made inevitable. The Betty story reveals that performance alone cannot guarantee success when purchased at the cost of crew survival. The extraordinary range meant nothing when aircraft couldn't survive the final 100 kilometers to target. The impressive speed provided no advantage when fighters could intercept with radar warning. Most importantly, the Betty demonstrates what happens when military technology is divorced from realistic combat assessment. The assumptions underlying its design, limited opposition, short war duration, proved catastrophically wrong within months of the Pacific War's start. By then, thousands of Betty bombers were already in service or production, and Japanese industry lacked capacity to replace them with better protected designs. American forces designed aircraft to bring crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft to reach targets regardless of cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 76312 at Clark Field provided final proof. The unprotected fuel tanks weren't an accident or oversight. They were a decision, one that cost thousands of men their lives in exchange for kilometers of range that ultimately meant nothing. If you found this deep dive into WWII aviation history fascinating, explore more untold stories from the Pacific War. What other superior designs hid fatal flaws? Let us know in the comments what aircraft you'd like us to examine next, and subscribe to never miss the engineering secrets that changed the course of history.